Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the UK-based leftist Christian podcast built on a foundation of care, friendship and love. I'm Ben Molyneux-Heathington. I'm joined by Adam Spears and Jonny Bell. Say hi, Adam.
Hello, friend.
Say hi, Jonny.
Hello.
And on the basis that we're built on care, friendship and love, and you've just said hello, friend, I just want to bring something out that I'm a little confused by. Neither of you have asked me for my new address, so you can send me my birthday presents for tomorrow. So I don't know if you're doing like a different thing that you don't need to send, or maybe you've spoken to Sarah about the address. I don't know. I just wonder what was happening there. Like,
I mean, I use the term friend in a very sort of generalized sense, right?
Like instead of saying, brother, it's in terms of Christ.
Well, like how Jeremy Corbyn said, our friends in Hamas that time.
Okay, so you see me how Jeremy Corbyn sees Hamas.
Yes.
And do you think Jeremy Corbyn bought Hamas a birthday present? I suppose is the question.
Well, clearly he's a terrorist sympathiser, right? So
Yeah.
Ben, I have a very important question for you. Where was my gift last week? So it was my birthday. Literally a week ago today.
Ben is the gift.
Happy birthday, Jonny. I had no idea
Thanks.
it was your birthday because I don't use Facebook, and that's mostly good. But like, obviously, the thing Facebook was exceptionally useful for was that it would tell you when people's birthdays were.
I have to say, like, Ben, you are like remarkably consistent. I mean, I think it's mostly your wife, but you are remarkably consistent with my birthday. And admittedly, my birthday is 3 days after Christmas, so it's quite easy to remember.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate that.
And I will say, actually, it isn't Sarah at all. It is me.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I check my diary like every few days for upcoming events, including birthdays in the next few weeks. So they are. There's one of the things that I like, one of those little things, and I send people birthday cards. And although I don't get birthday cards myself, people really like them. As in, not that I don't get them, as like receive them. I mean, I don't super understand why people like them, but people seem to like them.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm almost considering upgrading you to actual friend status.
That's delightful. You are now in my diary. In May, it will tell me that it is Jonny Brackett's podcast birthday.
Nice.
Just to identify you properly. I could have put your full name in, but instead, you will be known as Jonny Podcast.
It would have been shorter to put my full name in. Jonny Bell.
Today, we're going to talk not about people's birthdays, but instead we're going to do a follow-up conversation about democracy. We recorded an episode some time ago about democracy, and I say some time ago because this episode may sit in our vaults for a little while. So if you're listening to this and you know me personally and you think, but Ben's birthday was months ago, then that's why. If you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, Ben's birthday was last week, it means something went wrong and we released it much sooner than we were expecting.
Now I have to keep all of that birthday nonsense in the edit.
You don't have to keep all of it in. You can cut most of it. So yes, today we're going to talk a little bit about democracy, particularly in relationship to churches. You two did an episode on democracy a little while ago that is... we left kind of open to talk a follow-up episode, and then we left a long time to do the follow-up episode, but we are back now to look at democracy again. But before we get into that, we will start, as always, with what else is on my mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
So, on my mind grapes, I have been watching Andor, the Star Wars TV show, and I toyed with an intro that was Star Wars based, and like we were going to be the podcast that believed that Star Wars was better before they did all the politics stuff in it, but I couldn't quite make it make it work. I'm not going to talk about Star Wars, don't worry. Although, Adam, do you remember going to see the Force Awakens?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, in was it View in Exeter?
Yeah. We went to. I dragged Adam along to the midnight showing of the new Star Wars. It was of great excitement to me, and Adam just tolerated being dragged along to it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I like Star Wars to a point. The thing is, I've always been, there's always been this sort of weird, and there's no reason why it should be really, but there's always been this kind of weird rivalry between Star Wars and Star Trek. And I'm very much more a Star Trek fan, not the reboots, they're shit, than I have been a Star Wars fan. So it took me a while to sort of get into Star Wars, but, you know, it was fine. I mean, there was also... Who was the main person in that one?
Daisy Ridley, you mean?
That's right, Daisy Ridley. I don't mean this to be mean to her specifically. I don't know anything about her, but I also just find the fact that every single actor these days is just, especially if they're British, just posh, kind of privately educated wankers getting every single role. And so it grates on me a little bit. Particularly because she's playing someone who's like, I don't know, like an orphan and like been raised in the desert, being like harsh. And she's like, oh, hello, you know, just come on. let's be serious.
I mean, the arts generally are like that.
But they weren't always like that, right?
No.
They've become more like that in the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. The music is another one where you see this more and more, right? Like the percentage of private school educated people making music is, which is crazy because actually it's cheaper and easier to make music than it ever has been.
But arts and humanities, certainly in the academy, they're reserved for those who already have money, right? Because the only ones who can actually afford, because all the funding's been withdrawn, the only ones who can actually afford to make a go of it are people who have already got money. And so they plow all the money into STEM because they want more and more people to make bombs. But if you actually want to affect the culture, they want you to come from money.
Yeah. And I think there's things like rent prices and cost of living also feeds into that, because if you're struggling to survive, you're not going to have the capacity to be able to create and be creative. And actually things like, particularly in London, because that's where a lot of the arts are, regardless of whether you like it or not. I mean, rent prices are ridiculous. Like, I mean, I was in uni there nearly 20 years ago, and even then it was expensive.
So old, Jonny. So old.
I'm 37 now.
Wow. Middle-aged, hurtling towards you.
well, I suppose, I mean, technically, 74 is probably a good life expectancy for me with my health problems.
So anyway, that was to go back to what I was actually on my mind grapes, because we have classically diverted. I've been watching Andor, the Star Wars TV show, which is excellent. I don't know if either of you watched it, but you should watch it. And you shouldn't give any money to Disney. There are ways and means of watching these things. Because I knew Adam would immediately tell me off for giving Disney money. And I assure you I'm not. But one of the things that I've seen back is I've seen a lot of reaction to, there's been a couple of scenes where someone has encountered another character that they either haven't met before or have spent limited time on screen with, and acted with kind of care and compassion and like loyalty and all this sort of stuff. And I've seen kind of people go, oh, that was weird. We've never seen those two before. Why are they suddenly mates? And it made me think about the language of comradeship, and actually how we don't necessarily have the language or understanding of a relationship that is comrade. And I think actually what these people were not getting was that those weren't acts of friendship, they were acts of comradeship, right? And that is me kind of reaching beyond. I don't know what if that was the intention of the show or whatever, but it did make me think about actually how that is a form of relationship with other people that seems to be absent from our collective understanding of how to relate to other human beings.
Is Andor the sort of set in the rebellion period?
Yeah. So they're all like, they're essentially terrorists at this point. It's pretty great. Like
freedom fighters.
Yeah. Something really funny about the show is that they do these interviews, I think, partially out of a sense of not wanting to be like tied down to one specific thing, and partially because Disney tell them to, or the writers and directors or whatever are like, this isn't about one specific like event. This isn't like, we're drawing on lots of different historical things and how oppression and rebellion take place. And then, the main like center point of season 2 is about a planet being prepped for genocide using propaganda before they commit the genocide in order to get the natural resources there, and a key plot line is a politician being brave enough to say, hey, this is actually a genocide. And it's like, I can see why you keep saying this, but there is no one in the world watching this and not immediately thinking about Gaza. Like, this is so obviously about that.
Woke nonsense.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting, you know, I think I've seen other places where actually relating to someone you don't know, or maybe even someone you know a bit and maybe don't like very much, but they are still on your side, that they are still a comrade, is something that I think maybe is lost a little bit to us culturally, and I think it's actually a really important form of relationship to hold on to.
But I feel like that sense of camaraderie wouldn't have been lost on our communities sort of 50 years ago. I think there has been this kind of division, and things we have been sort of made into different areas and divided from each other, and don't really have a sense of community anymore. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps side effect of modern life. Who knows? But yeah, and I think people 50 years ago probably would have recognized that camaraderie much more readily than they do now, whereas today we think, I'm only like that with people who I know and know well, rather than thinking, you know, this is just how I treat people.
So let's move on now to our main topic of the day, where we're going to talk about democracy all over again. It was way back, was it episode 62, I think it was, that we last spoke about democracy, an episode that I wrote the notes for and then had to leave or wasn't able to join because I was stuck at work, which meant that the two of you were there. And I listened back to the episode, and you were very rude to me and very mean. And also in my absence, Adam got to talk a lot of anarchist bullshit about how democracy isn't good, actually. He basically went through the notes and was like, yeah, you can tell Ben's not an anarchist because he's like, yeah, democracy is good, but I hate it.
I think I was a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, you were. But and actually, we talked a bit there about how democracy functions as an ideology and what different definitions of democracy be. You know, I wrote in the notes about that thing about actually people ask when you hear you're a communist, don't you like democracy? And my answer would usually be, I do. One day I hope to live in one. And, you know, actually, people think of the UK as a democracy, but I mean, on the most basic level, is it a democracy? We've got an unelected head of state. Half the legislature is unelected. And then there's questions about democratic control of work, of media, of all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, we complicated democracy a little bit last time in helpful ways. And I think we wanted to talk about democracy as it relates to the church this time. And I think particularly some of the questions about how churches use the language or idea of democracy to push certain ideas or ideologies, or even just to further their own power.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in something of a unique position in this country in having, and I'm going to talk about one of my pet topics again, but we have an established church, right? We are officially a Christian country, and that brings with it certain ideas around democracy, certain ideas about the church's relationship with democracy that are massively ideological. So the way the church interacts with the state, the way the church functions as an arm of the state, and within that as something that is there to perpetuate a very specific idea of democracy, is kind of plainly obvious. But it's also, when you sort of extend that beyond the Church of England, the Church of England often sets the tone for ideas that churches have around politics, around how to deal with politics, how we should be thinking about politics, including the concept of democracy, which I think is reflected in the fact that whenever something happens, like someone important politically dies, or someone gets a nice shiny new hat, that signifies that they are now your overlord. The responses of various churches mirror that of the Church of England, right? They're always very, very positive, or, you know, whatever the Church of England is saying is that more or less just reflected by other churches, whether it be the Methodist Church, the URC, even some of the more sort of radical ones like, and I know that there's a question as to whether it even counts as a church these days, but Quakers, you know, will put out statements. So they'll be very radical on some things, on things like pacifism, for example, on whether you can call that radical, but, you know, very anti-war. But actually, they're still aligned with the sort of overarching ideological presuppositions that we have in a liberal representative democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to me that you see every church put out a kind of bland, inoffensive call for voting whenever a general election comes along. You know, no one ever says even something as relatively milquetoast as don't vote for reform, they're a bunch of dickheads, right? That is, you know, or don't vote for reform, they are antithetical to the teachings of Christ. Like, no one's even brave enough to put that out. It is a very insipid kind of boilerplate statement about the importance of voting, encouraging Christians to be involved, encouraging to take part, maybe something about how lucky we are to be in a situation where things are democratic.
I hate that one. I hate that one so much. It's just so sold out to the way things are. I find it very frustrating.
I've been trying to think, as you were saying that, why that's the case. Because obviously, in the society you're in, you're shaped by the things happening. Your subjectivity is shaped by what's going on. When I read the gospel, like or parts of the Bible, that really goes against a lot of those kind of milquetoast ideas. And there is a real dissonance, and you see it in people that they want to do these radical things, but there is something stopping them. And is that because they don't want to lose power, they don't want to lose comfort, they don't want to upset and therefore not please other people, they don't feel like they can? I don't know. I don't really know what it is, because whenever you read the gospel, and certainly whenever I am doing my services and I'm kind of saying, like, I think I've been now starting to say, no, we need to tax the rich. And people are like, yes, we do. But nothing happens.
It's because you should be saying that we need to eat them.
I
think that's interesting, though, is you know, that your point is that church is reflective of the society that it's in, right? And the society that we're in thinks of politics in a pretty milquetoast way. Like, even the most, well, actually liberal people are not going to go for the most radical things because they're liberals, right? And the church is no matter what denomination you're in, by and large, especially the white church, is a very middle class institution. Right. And the middle classes kind of have it nice. And even if you see that there are people suffering under this system, you know, the most you're going to get in any of these churches is a nod to the kind of anti-capitalism that is actually only anti a particular form of capitalism, not capitalism itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I find it interesting the way that there's kind of a mirroring here where the forms of democracy that are practiced within a lot of churches, on one surface level, you know, maybe you go along to an annual meeting at council, you elect, you know, certain people to certain roles, you know, whether that's church wardens in the Church of England, or whether you have some sort of trustee system or elders. You know, there are not all churches. Some churches are more specific about how power is utilized here, but in most churches, at the very least, because they have to have trustees, because for the charity commission to register as a charity, there will be some sort of democratic or democratic seeming process by which people are given certain roles in the church. And what I find interesting about that is that on a surface level, that looks really democratic. But as anyone who's been to any of these meetings, seen it in reality, almost all of these positions are uncontested. Everyone knows who's getting that role beforehand. And actually, if democracy is not just about giving people an occasional vote, but instead about the people who make up a community having genuine, actual power over the way things are done, that they can exercise with some level of ease, that there are not major barriers in the way of them exercising that power, then these are not really democratic institutions, actually. And I think you see a very similar thing. People talk about revolutions being fundamentally undemocratic, but a mass revolution that represents the will of the people can be a more democratic thing than a very closed system of parliamentary democracy, which only allows certain options and doesn't give people the opportunity to vote for what they actually believe in. So I think if we expand our concept of democracy to think about more about power and where it lies, and whether the members of a community do in fact have power over and within that community, then we can start to see that a lot of what passes for democracy, both in the church and in our country at large, isn't actually particularly democratic.
I want to slightly complicate the sort of church council thing that you were saying there. Yeah, I do think that sometimes it's a foregone conclusion for who's going to do what and how people use that power. But I think there's also another aspect that is reducing the efficacy of that sort of democratic or that shared power idea, is that there is an increasing amount of admin and governance that churches are expected to do, which is really, certainly in my context, it's a real thing that's making the churches struggle, because there's for all of the roles, there's almost this professional level of work that's expected by the charity commission, of these people who are sort of 70, 80 years old. They're doing it as a volunteer thing. And I mean, it often falls on me needing to do it because they just can't. And I think that's another real issue, which is actually another symptom of capitalism itself, of this ever increasing amount of administration and governance and complicated processes that are required of people. But that I think really chides against people from being able to have ownership of that. And I also find, as a result, they see the level of work that's required and the level of responsibility that's required, and they're like, no, I've been retired for years, I've only got a few years left to live, kind of thing. I don't want to be involved with that. So and so over there can do it for me.
Particularly when you've got a full-time minister, right? Like, it becomes really easy to give the full-time minister responsibility for all, because, you're going, well, actually, this is complicated and difficult, and you do this for work, right?
Yeah, indeed. And I understand it, whereas they don't. And they also don't have access to computers and the internet, which is often required. I'm working with really quite sort of, rural communities that struggle with this. And it's deeply frustrating because it gets in the way of being church. It gets in the way of people actually doing things. They're spending, I'm an administrator almost primarily as my role at the moment, because there is just so much to do, and that's not being church.
I mean, I've always thought that I just wish that churches were. I wish there was a bit more of a drive to see part of the role of, if you're going to have sort of ordained ministers, to see part of that role. We often talk about delegation. Oh, we need to delegate this, we need to delegate that. But actually, why can't part of the role of an ordained minister be around facilitating forms of direct democracy within the church and potentially within the community? Right. I recognize at the moment that, it's hard to get to the stage of even thinking about that because A, it's not on people's radars, and B, it's just too much work on at the moment. There's too much work on your plate. So you can't really get to the point of trying to change things in that direction. But ultimately, that could have the effect of obviously democratizing the decisions, making it genuinely, truly reflective of where people overall want to be, taking some of that power away from ordained ministers. And because I know that sometimes it might feel like you don't have a lot of power as an ordained minister, but ultimately you do. Even I've said this before, but Justin Welby talked about not having a lot of power. He didn't really have that much power. People thought he did, and it's like, mate, you talk to prime ministers and monarchs, like, if not on a daily basis, then very, very frequently. That is what power is, But similarly, as I say, on a local level, there's still some power, still some kind of authority that ordained ministers have. And I think it's about trying to implement something whereby you give that power away, but actually to the point where you don't even need to continue giving that power away, right? You transition to something where, hopefully for the most part, you're no longer occupying a position of power.
Yeah. And I think, I try to do that, I think. And I'm also quite explicit about my power. I will name it and actually say it to people. And I think it's quite helpful naming those things.
I didn't want this to sound like I was accusing you personally, Jonny, even though I am.
I know. Because the Methodist Church, in theory, can be very democratic. So anyone who's a church member can be on the church council. And certainly with the size of my churches, that could be everyone if they wanted. But again, it goes back to the not wanting that level of work. So one of the things in my churches, and I'm sure it's fine me talking about it, because it's not a confidential thing.
Certainly isn't anymore.
But it's a well-known thing in the community that people have been struggling with. And it may seem really like insignificant, but for the church it is, of whether to take out the preaching pulpit out. And it's one of those ones with stairs either side. And
take out preaching. Take out preaching. That'll democratize it.
That would. And it was turning into a big thing. So I decided to have a meeting and sort of naming the thing that actually this is how we use the church. This is the issue. It's not whether we keep a pulpit or not. It's how we use the church, how we are church, how we express it in this town, etc., etc. And so having a discussion about mission, but then also going, right, this is a really charged topic. We're going to talk about whether we're going to keep the lectern or not. We weren't making a decision that day, and we still haven't made a decision. But I sort of said to them, how are we going to prevent this from getting out of hand, and so that everyone can say what they want to say, but also enable everyone to be able to be heard? And put it to the room. They decided on the process that every person would say what they wanted, and it literally just go round, almost like a talking stick type thing. Literally just go round the room, and people can speak uninterrupted, and it moves on to the next person when they're ready. And that sort of thing, I think, works really well, because it gets the people who don't talk very often to talk. It gets the people who do a lot of talking to listen, and it enables that shared power to happen. I know power dynamics and relationships are more complicated than just that, but that is one tool for enabling that power to be more shared.
It's the starting point, that, isn't it? Chris Howson, when he was on before, talked about, and this was more in a sort of church like service context, but he talked about this idea of having a point at the start of the service where everyone is encouraged to speak into the space. because it allows people to take some kind of ownership over that sort of collectively and feel that they can say things going forward. And I know from my own experience living with bunch of anarchists, we would often start with something similar, and then it meant that we were all able to sort of chip in, and we had like other systems as well, like hand signals and so on. But it did mean that the discussion then, which was facilitated so it didn't have to be, super long, it meant that the discussion was able to flow more freely.
So I think we'll take a pause there, and we'll return in a minute to the topic of democracy and how that might look in churches, and what resources we might find in kind of the Bible and theology regarding democracy. But before we do that, let's have a little look at this week's Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Adam, I believe that you have a saint that I'm hoping is a human and not a dog.
He is a human.
How disappointing.
Well, I hope you feel really bad when I tell you about this person and what they did and what happened to them, Ben.
I mean, I'm disappointed that they're a human, so...
I'm a little bit surprised that we haven't done this person before, but I think there's a good reason for that. So this week I want to talk about Steve Biko, who you may well have come across before. He's a very well-known name in the anti-apartheid movement, and you may have seen the film about his life, Cry Freedom, which came out in 1987, and it's based on a biography written by a friend of his. So Steve Biko was born in 1946 in Eastern Cape. He was the third of four children. His dad was initially a police officer, and then later on was like a clerk in a court or something like that. And his mum was a domestic worker, but his dad died when he was 4 years old in 1950. So his mum had to raise him and his siblings from then on. And Steve Biko said that observing his mother's hardship is what politicized him. So he was raised as an Anglican, as all good people are. And he grew up in Ginsberg Township, which was kind of a mixed community. So we're talking at this time, apartheid, I think, came in, I think it was in 1948. One of the things with apartheid that I'm not sure people sort of realize these days, particularly if you're not South African, you don't know about it. And actually, a lot of white South Africans kind of don't know about it anyway, is that people, when apartheid came in, people were put into Bantustans, so one of 10 communities, and they were essentially ethnically cleansed and put into these areas where they essentially had to stay. And if they wanted to travel, so we're talking black people, right? If they wanted to travel, they had to have their passport with them at all times. These were some of the biggest forced resettlement in the 20th century. Thousands and thousands, if not millions, of people were moved to these Bantustans, right? And there were 10 of them, and some of them were sort of essentially treated as sort of de facto states in their own right. But of course, they existed within the South African state ruled by the white minority. And so conditions were appalling. So Steve Biko, this is the context that Steve Biko is growing up in. He was very, very smart. He skipped a grade in primary school, despite the fact that his teachers described him as kind of a bit naughty, a bit cheeky, but everything seemed to come to him very, very easily. He later on, though, went to a school called Lovedale, which was sort of a liberal school. And this played a big part in his politicization as well. So in 1964, police raided Lovedale to arrest his brother for ties to an illegal African nationalist group, but both brothers were arrested. And despite the fact that there was no evidence against Steve, he was nevertheless expelled from the school after only 3 months of going there. And this, he said, really is what gave him a strong resentment towards white authority, and authority in general. He said, I began to develop an attitude much more directed at authority than at anything else. I hated authority like hell. And then he goes and completes his schooling in a different college. And at this college, he really deepens his anti-apartheid convictions, and he starts to look at figures outside of South Africa in struggles that mirrored those. So, you know, your obvious ones like Malcolm X, who was sort of big around this time as well, but Ben Bella and Odinga from Kenya as well. When he goes to university, he joins the National Union, I can't remember what it's called, it's NUSAS, but a union of students that are supposedly integrated, even though there's, you know, it's difficult to make that happen. And he is elected to the Students' Representative Council. So that's the National Union of South African Students, right, which is a nominally non-racial student body. But during a congress in 1967, black delegates were segregated. They were sent to go and sleep in the church, whereas the white delegates slept in dormitory housing. And so Biko and others walked out in protest. And this is where he really starts to be critical of white liberal non-racism, right? Because actually it's not anti-racist. It just goes along with it more or less. And he later wrote that he began to feel that there was a lot lacking in the proponents of the non-racist idea. They took us for granted. Our understanding of our situation was not coincidental with that of these liberal whites. And so in response, he and a load of other black students formed an independent student organization. And this organization, which was called the South African Students Organization, was a blacks only organization, which was not to say that Biko was, and he did get stick from various sides for this. He wasn't saying that white people were bad or shouldn't be involved in the struggle or had no place in a future South Africa. He was saying that the way these organizations were constituted at that time meant that they were largely run basically by white people. So you have white people perpetuating apartheid, and the main opponents of that were also white people. And he felt that black people needed to build up their own self-confidence, that they needed to realize. And he popular, like his favorite phrase was "black is beautiful," because he felt that black people had just been made to think in a way that saw blackness itself as, you know, lesser. So he founds this, or co-founds this movement, and actually a broader movement starts to take shape from this and from other organizations that are formed as well, called Black Consciousness. In 1971, the manifesto for the SASO said, "Black consciousness is an attitude of mind, a way of life. The basic tenet is that the black man must reject all value systems that seek to make him a foreigner in the country of his birth and reduce his basic human dignity." And he was really influenced by people like Frantz Fanon and Malcolm X in this. Initially, the apartheid government was quite supportive of this, because they wanted people to be organizing along racialized lines, right? And so they were a bit slow off the mark to what was actually going on here. But they fairly quickly came to realize that this was really, from their point of view, quite dangerous, particularly as the movement began to grow and expand beyond university campuses. You know, they started to run community clinics. literacy programs, and other projects in townships, which of course is, when you start addressing things like poverty, becomes a real problem for those in power who want that kind of thing to continue. And so the apartheid regime started to respond more forcefully. Biko at this time was studying to become a doctor. He was at med school, but he ended up being expelled from medical school because his political work was taking up a lot of his time and energy, but also, he was bearing the brunt of a lot of the negative stuff that fell out from that. And so he was expelled from medical school. I think he had to repeat a year and then was expelled. And then in 1973, the Minister of Justice gave a 5-year banning order, which confined Steve Biko to his hometown. He wasn't allowed to leave his hometown. And there were some other activists who also were banned to their hometowns as well. But Steve, along with others, Steve would just frequently ignore this ban and just go and travel and talk to massive groups of people because the movement is growing and growing at this point. And in 1974, the ban was defied to celebrate Mozambique's independence. And the police raided offices, detained 200 activists, charged 13 under the Terrorism Act, and Biko testified as a defense witness for these people, which was his first public speech since being banned, and where he got to talk about black consciousness. And there's a wonderful scene in Cry Freedom, the film I talked about before, where you see this happening.
My lord, blacks are not unaware of the hardships they endure or what the government is doing to them. We want them to stop accepting these hardships, to confront them. People must not just give in to the hardships of life. They must find a way, even in this environment, to develop hope. Hope for themselves, hope for this country. Now, I think that is what black consciousness is all about. Now, without any reference to the white man, to try and build up a sense of our own humanity, our legitimate place in the world.
After the trial, he continued his underground activism. And in March 1977, he and some colleagues were briefly arrested, but were released after it gained public attention. But then in August 1977, he travelled to Cape Town secretly to negotiate unity among exiled and banned black activists. But the police intercepted him and his companion on a train and arrested them. And he was detained in Pretoria under terrorism charges. So that was August 16th. And by 12th of September, he had died in a police hospital cell, having been beaten and tortured by the police officers. And obviously this is treated again in the film with it's a film that you really must see, because part of it was that they could have taken him to a nearby hospital, but they refused to take him to that one and stuck him in the back of a van and drove him for miles to go to that one, which really finished him off. So in the wake of his death, obviously, this outraged people in South Africa, but it outraged the world. It got a lot of interest and was one of the driving forces of the sort of later anti-apartheid movement. Now, I haven't spoken a lot about his religious views, but they're really quite interesting. So I said he was raised Anglican, but his approach to religion started to become more critical and more complicated. He never rejected Christianity, but he was very critical, certainly of organized Christianity, of the church, and he also drew from sort of African religious concepts. But he also was kind of nodding towards kind of doing liberation theology, because of course liberation theology at this time is really kicking off, especially in South America. But that wasn't the only place doing liberation theology. Liberation theology was happening elsewhere, including in South Africa as well. And Steve Biko gave challenges to church leaders and religious leaders to reimagine Christianity, to make it something that was liberating. He said that Christian missionaries in South Africa have been some of the first people to really listen to and understand people in South Africa, but that they had preached a theology of hell, right, which had just tried to scare people into believing their religion. And he said that Christianity was a cold, cruel religion. And that was not him saying it was the wrong religion, but it was him criticizing a kind of Christianity, the kind of systematized, organized form of Christianity. So his religious belief, he definitely believed in God, but he was kind of unorthodox in his beliefs. He never rejected God. He never really rejected Christianity, which is why I've just sort of about like scraped him in here as a saint of the week. But he was very, very critical of a lot of the ways it kind of looked. He told black churches, God is not in the habit of coming down from heaven to solve people's problems. Which is interesting, because I think there's a deep truth in that, and yet how do we frame the incarnation whilst recognizing that deep truth? You know, some people claim that he was an atheist, some people claim that he wasn't a Christian. He was probably just an unorthodox Christian. So yeah, that's Steve Biko. Obviously really important for the anti-apartheid movement, and really important in challenging church leaders in South Africa and beyond to see Christianity as and remake Christianity as a religion of liberation rather than a religion of the oppressor.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you're saying, because in some ways, you almost feel like there's some contexts in which the only people that are making it into consideration for Saint of the Week are ones where people are going, I don't really know if they are actually Christian, right? Like, actually, you know, you kind of describe it as unconventional, unorthodox, whatever. And it's, I don't know, in some ways when the religion is functioning in that particular way, it's hard not to come across as someone who is opposing that religion or is anti that religion when you're actually being faithful to that religion.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think he was Christian. He didn't go to church, but I think he was. I think he retained a form of Christianity that was nevertheless able to see the value not only in some of the liberating threads within the Bible and within the Gospels and the life of Jesus, which is, by the way, what he talked about. He said the thing that he was interested in was the revolutionary ideas of the historical Jesus. That's what he said, because he wanted to remake society as a socialist society, right? So that was what he was interested in. But he was also able to draw from some of the more communal ideas that were found in a lot of African religions. So he didn't just sort of say, as some Christians will, a lot of Christians will, that these are terrible things and pagans, etc., etc. He pointed to the good stuff that African spirituality often had to offer. And I just think that's a far more, apart from anything, it's just a far more mature approach to faith, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things there is yeah, he didn't go to church, but actually he was being church. Like, church is not about a building and doing specific rituals. Or I know some people do believe that, but I don't. And the church is people, and God working through those people for creating change. And the thing you were saying about was it the SASO, one of the movements he was doing that was for a black only space. It's so interesting when you've got an oppressed group, and as soon as they want to take up space, there's oh, you can't do that. Like having their own space to do that, and safe space for, yeah, as you say, for nurturing and sort of building themselves up. And then again, as soon as those movements became politically powerful and threatening the status quo, again taking up their space, that's when the government or whoever were saying, no, you're not allowed to do that anymore. It is very that pattern.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I said that he kind of got it from all sides on this, and he did. Because he was setting up a blacks only kind of space, and by blacks what they meant back then, right? Because I don't know if you know how apartheid worked, but it was a system of there were 4 races essentially recognized within South Africa, and there was a hierarchy. Each one was under the next. So you had the top of the hierarchy were whites, under whites were Indians, under Indians were what they call coloureds, which is essentially mixed race, and usually black and white people, because one of the things that happened with apartheid is that it became illegal to have relationships between different races. And then at the bottom were blacks, and those bottom 2, coloureds and blacks, were differentiated into subcategories as well. And so setting up what he called, what they called, in fact, the movement called blacks, he included Indians and coloureds into that movement as well. And so he got it in the neck a little bit from some of those saying, no, it needs to be a what we would now call a blacks only kind of movement. And he got it in the neck from them because even though he was setting up a movement for black people that was exclusionary of white people, he wasn't exclusionary of white people from the overall movement. He had white friends. His biographer was white, that wasn't the issue. It's just that he needed this black consciousness movement to be something that took effect, for black people to be the driving force behind their own liberation, right? And that's a very key principle in liberation theology as well, which I think we always need to remember. So he got it in the neck from that side, but then obviously got it in the neck from the other side, from some liberal whites as well, and from obviously the apartheid regime as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was really interesting. And it was good to learn more about someone I knew of but didn't know a lot about.
Saint of the week.
So let's return to talk a little bit more about churches and democracy. And I guess one of the arguments I've seen that I thought would be interesting to address is this question of, well, actually, Christianity doesn't encourage democracy. If you look at the Bible, there's very little in the way of democracy going on as a kind of method of governance within that context. But also fundamentally, it's a monarchical religion, right? There is God and he is in charge, and Christ is king, and we do what we're told by Christ. So I guess I'm interested in how you two would kind of integrate ideas of democracy into Christianity, when on the surface, at least, it feels like there isn't a natural combination of the two.
Well, there's to start with, an interesting idea from Catherine Tanner that actually she argues that it's blasphemous to compare God to human relationships with human to human relationships. So to use God and humanity as our model for structuring ourselves is actually blasphemous, because no one is God and we are human, so we need to do it differently to how God sees it. I mean, that's one perspective. Not sure I entirely agree with God being so far removed that there is a complete otherness, because obviously Jesus Christ, etc. But yeah, there is an interesting thing where you shouldn't compare the human to human with God to human.
I mean, I also think that we so often fall into this trap of imagining that because the Bible talks about monarchy, that therefore that is the only thing that it talks about and everything must be aligned with that. Because the Bible doesn't just talk about monarchy. You know, it's not the only way decisions were made across all time in the Bible. Because the Bible, as I will apparently never tire of pointing out, does not speak with a single unified voice, right?
What?
So, I know.
Heresy! Remove this filth!
But, you know, there are plenty of examples of decision-making processes being taken that don't reflect that model. And of course there are. Because when you've got a sort of insurgent movement, insurgent not necessarily in the kind of sense that some might imagine of you know, going around with guns and killing people, but an insurgent movement as in like a new movement, of course decisions are going to be made in slightly different ways, slightly more flexible ways, slightly more communal ways. You know, in Act 6, you see an example of community decision making taking place when they select deacons. So you can't just sort of point to one thing and say, well, that's what it is. You know, prior to the sort of monarchy thing, obviously you had judges, which were probably not, they probably didn't actually have that much power as such. It would have been a sort of tribal chieftain kind of system a bit more, which I'm not suggesting is necessarily democratic, although there might have been elements of democracy within that. But the point is there's a plurality of different ways of organizing reflected throughout the Bible. So we can't just point to that one that just so happens to be the one that aligns with power, you know, and say, well, that's the model then, because it isn't. And I think when we look at the psalmist, when we look at Proverbs, you know, when we look at the wisdom literature, you know, it talks about many counselors. I can't remember where, but it talks about like many counselors. And I think there's a sort of implicit understanding that things are a little bit more complicated than just having one person making all the decisions, you know, that wise counsel is something that's needed.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think as well about actually the idea of reading and discerning the Bible being something that is done communally or done best communally, right? And even, you know, you look at the history of the Bible, and without going into, you know, any real depth, the reason that the books of the Bible, particularly New Testament, became, you know, canonized as the books of the Bible was because a plurality of different people had recognized them as inspired, right? There was no point where one person, despite what you might hear, there was no point at which one person said, I have decided these are the books, and a bunch of Christians went, oh, I've never heard of some of these, but all right, crack on. The reason that those books were chosen was because they were already recognized as inspired by a community. And that's not to say that it was strictly democratic in terms of the process of discerning what books were meant to be in there, but that there was a democratic element because the decision was made based on the community's actual kind of lives and the way they responded to certain texts, right? And actually, I think, you know, democracy isn't just voting on what the correct interpretation of a Bible passage might be, but actually there's something inherently more democratic about a conversation between equals around how to approach the Bible, read certain scriptures, what actions to take, even if that doesn't culminate in a vote, right? If we've got that broader understanding of democracy, there's something inherently democratic about that. So actually the not only does the original kind of providence of the Bible come in some ways from a kind of democratic process, but actually the way we should approach it is best discerned democratically.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I would add to that as well, this idea of the church as a body that we see in the epistles, right? And each person having a part within that. There's something that there's to me, there's an inherently sort of democratic kernel to that. And also, remember, we're still, when the Bible is, the New Testament certainly is being written, we're talking about societies that were still really paternalistic, really hierarchical, stratified societies. And so you're not necessarily, you're not going to get people joining the movement whose thinking is perfect straight away. What you get is new things happening, exciting difference taking place. The fact that you had women for the first time in that society really taking fairly central roles a lot of the time and having a voice, that is opening things up. And I think if we take that principle of opening things up to its logical conclusion, then we end up somewhere, notwithstanding my silly anarchist reservations to the idea of democracy as we have had it handed down to us, we end up with something that, taken to its logical conclusion, is incredibly democratic.
But this is me complicating it, could there be an issue?
No.
Could there be an issue with, because if you see God as the sort of central power, so power is centralized in God, therefore those who are closest to God, and bearing in mind that's how the church has understood this for a long time, but also the philosophy informing people's understanding of the world was like that when the Gospels and letters and everything were written. So those closest to God were most like God, and it was almost this concentric thing going out. So if you've got this centralized power, and those closest to the power are the most holy, good, powerful, whatever, that goes against that democratic idea, surely.
Well, that could be one incorrect way of interpreting it, yeah. But I think my pushback on that would be that actually I think you're perhaps over-egging some of that understanding. It wasn't just that was the way people saw it. Otherwise we wouldn't end up with ideas like kenosis, right? And that is an idea where God is literally giving away power, right? And that to me seems to be a fairly fundamental concept at the heart of what is happening on the cross, right? And not just on the cross, but at the heart of the incarnation, right? God comes down and gives away power and gives power to those who would kill him, right? Which is why I like this idea of, when you go to some churches and they don't say kingdom, they say kingdom, and it can be a bit cheesy, but I really like it because it's a reframing. We use a lot of metaphors and allegories and so on when we're talking about the gospel that Jesus was proclaiming and that the church was proclaiming going forward. And we use allegories of war, and we use allegories of kingship and that kind of thing, but that doesn't mean that those things are actually, that they actually wanted a kingdom as such, that they actually wanted war as such. They were using them to describe something else. And when we look at the way Jesus frames this kingdom, in the Beatitudes, we see something completely topsy-turvy. Right? The first will be last, the last will be first. It's equalizing it. It's leveling it. And that to me is fairly fundamental to the message that Jesus was preaching.
So is there something from what you're saying about that outpouring, that kinetic love, power, etc., something about God facilitates us to have power, and therefore we need to facilitate others to have power?
I think if power is something, so anarchists will often talk about power because they will often conceive of power as the thing that the powerful have, right? Like those in power. And so they will say, like, I think Benjamin Zephaniah has this has this saying that I have on a sticker, which I kind of love, where he just says "fuck power," and I that resonates with me if you're thinking about power in those ways. But if we want to get all postmodern about it, which I know you'll love, we can equally see power as something that really, Foucault talks about this, where he talks about power being something that is in reality, real power is disparate, spread out, right? And if we imagine power in that way, where we hold power collectively, then fine. There's perhaps something to that. And when you sort of combine that with ideas of the kingdom of God, where God is coming down, giving away power, but also facilitating power to be taken by everyone, and in a sense by no one, then why not?
Are you sure that fuck power is not just like one of the categories on his top trumps card?
Bringing it down to a normal level there.
Yeah, you're using lots of big words, talking about theorists and power and stuff, and all I was going is,
You communists. You rattle off a lot of fancy words, don't you?
This is nice, you Adam. You get Jonny as a fresh audience for this.
That's
for
true.
All your new clips.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. An interesting thing is that, I think I said in theory, the Methodist Church is quite democratic. Another thing that the Charity Commission is kind of doing to sort of erode that democratic way of working is, so we have what's called the conference, which is kind of like General Synod, but far more lay people who actually have power. And so our bishop is the conference, basically, to put it that way. So our episcopacy is the conference, and that's made up of 200-300 people.
Heresy! Remove this filth!
And they're all elected representatives from different parts of the Methodist Church in Britain, and they all have equal voting power. One of the issues, though, is the Charity Commission doesn't like the idea of a charity being governed in that way. So they turned around and say, you need fewer people. So we have now what's called the Connectional Council, which is formed of, I think, 20 odd people who are not elected democratically to be in that. Most of them, I think all of them currently are ordained and quite senior in the church. And they have, the conference is still operating, but the Connectional Council has the power to override the conference in some ways and make decisions on behalf of the conference. And that's something that the Charity Commission has kind of forced us to have. And I find that really problematic in terms of our ecclesiology, the way we are church. And we still don't know what the implications will be, because it's an evolving process, and it's a kind of, people say, oh, it's not going to change much, or things will be the same, or whatever, or it'll be more efficient, or whatever. But we don't know how it's going to work, and we don't know how those individuals are going to use their power, and we there isn't that level of accountability in the same way either, which I think is concerning some people, myself included. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves and how that changes how we're church.
I think these things often have a habit of trending towards the consolidation of power, even when it looks like. So there's kind of was going to say similar thing. It's almost the opposite in a sense, in that it was they were trying to head towards a more democratic system when the General Synod of the Church of England was sort of instituted in 1970, right? So it replaced the Church Assembly, and it ostensibly made it a far more democratic way of doing things. It created a tricameral system where you had House of Laity, House of Clergy, House of Bishops, and for each thing that was passed, you had to get like 70% in each of the houses. So it was a high bar by many standards. But I think essentially what happened was that you still ended up with a situation where those positions were largely, though not entirely, adopted by people, and people were elected who were still very much within the church and within the system. Even the sort of more progressive ones still kind of, I think, like it how it is a lot of the time. And I wonder whether there might be a similar thing happen with the Methodist Church. I could well be wrong. But I think often when you see these changes sort of enforced on people, you still end up sort of trending towards the entrenchment of power, I think. So good luck with that.
Just be more like the Anglican Church and be completely undemocratic from the start and roll with it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it'd be better. It'd be better than
The rotten system you call communism.
I think that is probably all we have time for now. So thank you both very much. And thank you for listening. If you would like to get in contact with us, we love to hear from people. If you're watching on YouTube, comment. If you're a normal person who listens to podcasts rather than watches them, then you can rate and review us places. You can send us emails. You can get in touch via social media.
Send us a text.
You can. All the contact details are breadandrosaries.com, and there is a phone number to text us in the show notes. So have a look at that if you would like to get in touch. Jonny, I believe you are impossible to contact unless you want to wander the streets of Norfolk.
Absolutely. Intentionally so.
Yeah. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places: TikTok, Blue Sky, Instagram, @Commie, XIAN. Oh, and YouTube as well, on there too.
So yeah, if you want to contact Adam, that's the way to do it. If you want to contact Jonny or me, you do have to message us through the podcast, because we will not be sharing our personal contact details. We'll set a Patreon goal, and if you get to it, I'll give you Jonny's phone number. How about that?
I thought we weren't going to have anything behind a paywall, Ben.
Yeah, nothing apart from your personal phone number is
So
behind a paywall.
I was going to say, we'll give out Johnny's phone number now then.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. It's like a work number, so it's fine.
Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Thank you both for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you later.